Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this live webinar hosted by the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center. Let me just put on the welcome page so that you can see who we are. So welcome to this live webinar hosted in partnership by the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center, the Armenian Youth of South Africa, and the University of Leeds. For those of you who've just joined us, I want to ask you to just be patient with us because we are expecting quite a large and also an international audience. So as our team lets people in, please just be patient with us. So this particular webinar and event is titled The Representation of the Armenian Genocide in the Literary Works of Edgar Hilsenrath. And it's presented by Professor Frank Finlay. And I have to mention that on the 24th of April, which is this Saturday, is the Armenian Genocide Remembrance Day or Armenian Genocide Memorial Day. I'll speak more about this once more people have joined us. So I just wanted to mention that at the very beginning, because that is really the reason why we are here, to commemorate the Armenian Genocide, which happened in 1915. So for those of you who have already joined us, my name is Mdunduli, and I'm part of the education team at the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center. And it is a pleasure to have you here. Thank you very much for taking time out of your evening, out of your dinner to join us in this very special event that is meant to commemorate the genocide against the Armenian people during World War I. It's quite a packed event. So I'm just going to announce a few housekeeping rules that I hope you will all remember during this event. So please make sure that your sound is muted. So throughout the presentation, please make sure that your sound is muted so that we don't have any background noises that interfere with the presentations and the videos that we'll be playing for you today. And also, I just have to remind you that this event is being recorded. So if you don't wish to appear on screen, please just cut your video and keep your sound on, but just cut your video so that your face will be hidden. However, if you don't have a problem with being seen by the world, by all means, please keep your video on. However, I do encourage you to use the chat function, which is at the bottom of your screen, to post your comments and to post your questions to our team and our panelists. And then our team will gather those questions and comments throughout the event. And then at the end, we will have a chance to interact with your questions and your comments. So please, throughout the event, remember, if you have a question or a comment, just post it in the chat function, which is at the bottom of your screen. So I'm coming to you live from Johannesburg. This is a live event, and I'm your host, Mdunduli from Johannesburg. Would you be so kind to please tell us where you are joining us from? I know we have an international audience. There are people from all over the world. So please tell us where you're joining us from. Obviously, we have people joining us from Germany. We have people joining us from the United States, the very interesting United States. And we have people obviously joining us from South Africa in the various cities in South Africa. So please, would you be so kind as to tell us where you are joining us from? Let me see if people have already written. So we have Talines joining us from Johannesburg. And we have Professor Frank Finlay joining us from the UK. Let's see, please tell us where you are joining us from. It's always interesting to know where people are joining us from. And also, just as another question, I want to ask you, what is your knowledge of the Armenian Genocide? What is your knowledge of this history of the Armenian Genocide? Could you just write that on the chat? Do you work in this field? So maybe you know a little bit about it because it's part of your work. Are you joining us from Armenia? Or are you related to someone who is connected to the nation of Armenia or the Armenian genocide history in any way? What is your relation or what is your knowledge of the Armenian genocide? It would be so nice to know. And please continue posting on the chat where you are joining us from. We'll begin the webinar very, very shortly, in a few minutes' time. I just want to let a few more people in. We are expecting a few more people, so I'll give them, let's say, maybe 2 more minutes as our team lets people in, and then we'll officially begin the webinar. We have people joining us from Cape Town. We have people joining us from Durban. So welcome to all of you who are joining us from wherever you are joining us from. We have Jennifer Rudner, who's joining us from Johannesburg. Welcome, Jennifer. Thank you for joining us. We are expecting, obviously, quite a huge crowd from Johannesburg. So Tali says, Tali Nates, who I will also introduce when the webinar begins officially, says, I visited Armenia in December 2018. What a beautiful country. And it's so interesting that a lot of people, some people may know about the genocide against the Armenian people. Some people may not even realize that Armenia is a country, that there is such a country that exists called Armenia. So it's always interesting to discover that. And I think a lot of people will be informed and their eyes will be opened, particularly about the people of Armenia, and that there is such a thriving, vibrant Armenian community in South Africa. That's always amazing to discover. And we do have a representative from the Armenian youth of South Africa joining us today. So I'll introduce him as well during the course of the event. So for those of you who've just joined us, my name is Mdun Duli, and I'm part of the education team at the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center. And welcome to this live special event that is part of the commemoration of the Armenian Genocide, which took place in 1915, perpetrated by the Ottoman Empire. And of course, this webinar will unpack and deepen our understanding of that genocide and that history. And particularly looking at the story, the novel called The Story of the Last Thought by the German Jewish author Edgar Hilsenrath. And our speaker today is Professor Frank Finlay, and he will unpack this work by Edgar Hilsenrath, and I hope I'm pronouncing that surname correctly, which is part of the representation of the Armenian Genocide in the literary works of Edgar Hilsenrath. So it promises to be a very interesting, very eye-opening, and also very deep conversation and presentation by Professor Finlay. I'll just wait a few more minutes before I officially begin, because I think a few more people are joining us. So Scott Bernay or Burnett, or I should say Scott Bernay, he's saying, hi, everybody. He's joining us from Burnett. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. So Scott, you're saying you're here as a Joburger by joining from Gothenburg in Sweden. And you say, I know some basic details of the Armenian genocide and have an academic interest in memory, racism, and discursive construction of history. Wow. So maybe at some point, Scott, you'll engage with us. Maybe you'll post a question or you post a comment, and then that'll open an opportunity for us to engage with you so that you can share some of your knowledge and some of your interests. That will be very, very exciting. So thank you, Scott. Thank you for that. And then we have Christina Flett, Christina Subsesian Flett. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. So she's joining us from Geneva, Switzerland, and is a descendant. So she's saying, I'm of Armenian descent, so have an interest in the history of the Armenian genocide. Thank you for organizing this event. Thank you, Christina. Wow. So I also hope you will be able to engage with us during the question and answer session. And so, yeah, so Frank is just basically answering Scott. So thank you. So the conversation in a way has already started. Thank you. So I'll just wait one more minute before we start, and then I'll officially begin. So we have Heather Blumenthal, say hi from Cape Town. So Heather is the director of the Cape Town Holocaust and Genocide Center. So welcome, Heather. Thank you for joining us and the continued partnership between the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center, the Cape Town Holocaust and Genocide Center, and the Durban Holocaust and Genocide Center. So those are the three: partnership and collaboration. And I hope it continues for much, much, much longer. Okay, I am going to now begin the webinar. So let me stop sharing my screen so that we can all see each other. So everyone, welcome. So for those of you who have already joined us, welcome. Armenian Genocide Remembrance Day, or Armenian Genocide Memorial Day, is a public holiday in Armenia and the Republic of Artsakh, and is observed by the Armenian genocide, about the Armenian genocide of 1950. This genocide was a series of massacres and starvation of about 1.5 million Armenians by the Ottoman Empire. In Yerevan, the capital of Armenia, hundreds of thousands of people walk to Tsita Nakabert Genocide Memorial to lay flowers at the eternal flame. Some of this history is told through the novel, The Story of the Last Thought, written by German Jewish writer Edgar Hilsenrath, and is about the Armenian genocide in 1915. The epic novel, which has the form of a fairy tale and for which Hilsenrath received many prizes, is regarded as one of the most important books about this history. And in 2006, in fact, the president of Armenia presented the author with the State Award for Literature of the Republic of Armenia for his work, for this particular work. So this story is going to form part of the discussion today, and to unpack this novel and to deepen our understanding and our knowledge of this novel and the history of Armenia and the Armenian genocide and the importance and significance of the commemoration and Day of Remembrance on the 24th of April, we have Professor Frank Finlay. So Professor Frank Finlay is the Executive Dean in the School of Languages, Cultures, and Societies in the Faculty of Arts, Humanities, and Cultures at the University of Leeds. His focus interests are German literature, its social historical context, the role of the writer, intellectual, contemporary Austrian drama, literature and National Socialism, post-1989 narrative fiction, and colonialism. Also joining us in today's conversation and commemoration is David Abrahamian, who's the founder and representative of the Armenian Youth of South Africa. We are privileged tonight that we'll be able to hear a message from Mr. Abrahamian. So thank you very much for joining us, Mr. Abrahamian. And then also joining us in this conversation and event is Director Tali Nates, who is the Executive Director of the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center, which features the story of the Armenian genocide in our permanent exhibition. So thank you very much for all of you, to all of you for joining us today. Before I hand over to begin the event officially, I'd just like to hand over to David. And David is going to give us a message and also deepen our understanding and appreciation of the Armenian genocide.
Thanks, Stu. Thanks for introduction. Good evening, everyone. I'd like to start by thanking Tali, first of all, for very long partnership already. We've been working together since 2014, when before the Holocaust and Genocide Center was built. And the partnership continued through the years, and we've done some interesting things in the past. And thank you, Tali, for that. And thank you, of course, for the work you do, I think, in general, about the genocide education, not just about Armenian genocide. I think many people underestimate the importance of this work, because genocide is something that happens repeatedly. And for us, we're grateful for the opportunity to share our story as a part of a whole chain of other stories of other nations who suffered genocide, to highlight that it's not an isolated event that affects just one nation or one country or one minority in a specific country. It is something that repeatedly happens, and it continues to happen as we speak. I think for us Armenians, this year's commemoration is very, very different. At least in my lifetime, I can say, because I grew up not really seeing a war directly. And last year we woke up to not just a war, but in Armenia, where Armenia was attacked with, I'm not going to go into the war itself, but I think the stress that we relieved and the feedback I had from friends, where they were talking about specific primal level fear for their lives. So this is not just about the defeat, this is not about the lives lost or territories lost and the actual politics of what happened in a war and why it happened. But the very concept that the crimes against humanity can happen again. And they can repeat at different scales, be it pogroms or massacres or another large scale perpetrated, prepared genocide. But these things can happen again. And that's where this year is very different for us, that we had to relieve that trauma again. We had to relieve the danger, which we don't even know if it's completely gone or not. We don't know if the treaty that was signed last year going to be enforced or valid for very long. We don't know, because those are the neighbors we happen to have. And this continual understanding that these things can happen again, can happen to us, can happen to others, is what brings home the importance of it. And the genocide education, that's why we share our stories, it applies in every context of segregation and otherness. And it's important that, like the work that Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center does with schools, for example, it's a direct preventive measure to educate children to recognize what and how can lead them to become tools of genocide or of any other type of violence and crime. The representation in literature, which we're gonna talk about today, Professor Finley gonna talk about, is the biggest tool that we have to talk about it, because we have media representation, we have fictional literature, but if you go back, like even at 1915, fortunately, we have digitized archives of New York Times that was reporting on each separate atrocities as they were happening. The books that followed by Ambassador Morgenthau that documented his experience while being ambassador in Turkey. And then later other books came out, and Franz Werfel's 40 Days of Mossadegh in 1933, for which then, those books were later burned, and he was persecuted. And the list goes on. And interestingly, in contemporary literature as well, we've got this cases where writers are persecuted for their views and their sympathetic views sometimes that they express, like the Isis Lee in Azerbaijan, that was stripped of all his honors and pension, and even bounty was offered for his ears to be cut off. So we go through this and we see how this topic perpetuates and how it does not go away, rather. So before I hand over to Professor Finley, I want to leave you with a recording that we done at the Holocaust and Genocide Center last year in November. The song is called Grung in Armenian. It's as the crane, and it epitomizes the sadness, I suppose, of diasporans who always want to hear good news, or rather hoping not to hear bad news. And this is how we're continuing to deal with reality. And the song is over 100 years old, but it's still pertinently present in our lives. And the theme of the song is present, and how it makes us feel is present. So I'll just leave you with that one. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Thank you, David.
Listen to music ad-free.
Let me...
YouTube Music Premium. Start a 1 month.
Sorry about that. Thank you, David, for that very touching message and for that music. Even though sometimes some music does not have language, but the emotion is the language. And that sometimes is the power of art. And at the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center, we use art as part of the way we educate youth, whether it be music, whether it be poetry, whether it be visual art, whether it be drawings, but art has a language of its own. And at this time, I would like to introduce the director, the executive director of the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center, Tali Nate, who is going to officially introduce our speaker today, Professor Frank Finlay, but also perhaps tell us a little bit about the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center and why it is so significant that we feature the Armenian Genocide as part of our permanent exhibition.
Thank you very much, Mdu. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon to everyone joining us today to this 106th commemoration of the Armenian Genocide. It is an honor for the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center, and indeed our sister centers, the Cape Town Holocaust and Genocide Center and the Durban Holocaust and Genocide Center, all under the Association of the South African Holocaust and Genocide Foundation, to partner with the Armenian youth of South Africa for many, many years, and to partner with other Armenian communities in the world, and to recognize and remember the genocide of 1915 to 1923 that claimed the lives of over 1.5 million Christian Armenians. It is important to remember massacres, mass atrocities that happened before the word genocide was coined. The word genocide was only coined in 1944, actually towards the end of the Holocaust, by Raphael Lemkin, a Polish Jewish lawyer that really was so disturbed by what happened in Armenia, and that there was no word to describe this crime of the intentional and systematic destruction of a people. He coined the word, and not only that, he did not stop at that, but he also drove and insisted on passing an international law that was adopted by the United Nations in December of 1948, as we know it today, as the Convention for the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. And it is an honor to have one of the only exhibitions outside of Armenia about this genocide in South Africa, in our center. It is of great importance for us to include it in all our educational activities with schools, and it is something we will continue to do as we continue to develop our educational programs in the future. And one of these educational programs is called the Change Makers Program. It's a program that really develops youth leadership, not only in South Africa, but in 12 countries in Africa. And actually a 13th country is coming along in May, and that will increase the numbers to 13. And this educational program is proudly partnered with the University of Leeds for some years now. And I'm so pleased to have my friend, my colleague, Professor Frank Finlay, that I last saw during this Changemakers program in Rwanda in February of 2020 in one of our training sessions, join us tonight He is as you heard, a professor of German language and literature and dean of cultural engagement at the University of Leeds in the UK. But more importantly, he's a partner of the South African Holocaust and Genocide Foundation for many, many years in different projects, and a good friend of the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center. Frank, the Zoom floor is yours. I'm very much looking forward to learn from you today. Frank, can you hear me?
Are yeah, sure.
You can, yeah, the floor is yours.
Okay. Okay. The inevitable slight technical hitch, apologies. Thank you ever so much for that wonderful introduction. I'd just say very briefly what a huge honor and privilege it is to have the opportunity to revisit the Johannesburg Centre I first visited when it was still being built a few years ago, and I've returned to several times. I'm coming to you remotely. The background is covering a rather untidy bookshelf, but that is the round reading room at the University of Leeds. And I just say, as I say, it's an enormous privilege, and I'm actually still moved at the opening addresses, by the opening addresses, and by that wonderful piece of music that we've just heard. What I'm going to do today is to, as we've heard, talk about this particular book in a broader context, and I think it's significant as a literary representation. We heard from David about the power of literature. It was written in the 1980s, first published in 1988, but it had been something like 20 years in the making, and it was published at a time when some of the facts of the Armenian Genocide were still being disputed by historians, and also when recognition for it, which remains quite limited, in recognition in strict terms as being a genocide, was even less than is the case today. So in many ways, this book can be regarded as making a literary case for recognition of the massacres in Armenia that we've heard about already as being a genocide. And the inference of that, of course, is it's also a case for restitution for the Armenians on the basis of having been the victims of a genocide. But it's more than that. It's also, as I will hope to show, an act of commemoration and I suppose restoration, because we know that genocide's goal to eliminate a whole cultural ethno-religious group is often accompanied by the simultaneous destruction of that group's civilization or culture. And we'll see in this novel that not only do we have a historical account of certain events that occurred, but we have really a memorial that is erected in words and stories, through fantasy and the imagination, to the lost civilization of the Armenians of Asia Minor, who first settled there in the 4th century. I will now, sorry, there's another fault on my line. I will now quickly move to my next slide, hopefully. There we go. I'm sure the technology will settle down in a moment. So I'm just going to kind of frame my talk really by showing you a brief video clip. The starting point for this is really picking up on the point I've just made about the wholesale denial that a genocide took place in Armenia. You'll see from the heading here that it's a protest against a stage version, a stage adaptation of Hilsenrath's story. Das Märchen von letzten Gedanken, the fairy story of the last thought, of just a few years ago.
Am Abend in der Konstanzer Innenstadt und zogen bis zum Stadttheater. Damit wollten sie nach eigenen Angaben nicht das Theaterstück verhindern, aber ihren Unmut zeigen über ein Werbeplakat des Theaters. Auf dem Plakat eine Leiche zusammen mit der türkischen Flagge und einem Zitat des türkischen Ministerpräsidenten.
Okay, so we'll just halt it there. The reason for the protest was because of the use of one word. The German is for genocide is Völkermord, literally the murder or the elimination of a people. The theatre had used this in the advertising and the marketing of the stage show, and this brought wholesale condemnation from nationalist groups, Turkish nationalist groups living in Germany, but also from diplomatic quarters. So here we have on the next slide, this is a letter from the General Consulate of the Republic of Turkey protesting the use of this word. I'll just highlight it here, Völkermord, that comes up in the text. So that little incident really serves me as a way into my topic. We've got this wholesale denial that has taken place, and of course, with the century that gave birth to the term genocide, even as we've just heard from Tali, it took decades before Raphael Lemkin was able to define it, and you have the definition up there on the screen. We've had wholesale denial by the Turkish authorities, and also around the world a failure to express recognition that the genocide had taken place. The extraordinary lengths to which Turkey sometimes goes to deny the genocide. We've got a small example with the protest against Hilsenrath's play, but it goes to even more extraordinary events. So Pope Francis, a couple of years ago, used the term genocide in relation to Armenia, and it led to the Turkish government withdrawing its diplomatic representation to the Vatican. As I say, that's quite extraordinary. And certainly when it was the 100th anniversary in 2015, dates were moved in Turkey to mark the 100th anniversary of Gallipoli, which was clearly a key event during the First World War for the Ottomans, in order to prevent international leaders participating in the commemorations that were taking place in Armenia itself. So let's move on to just a brief consideration of this definition. You'll notice that the talk is about an intent to destroy a group, be it a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group, gives examples that constitute such destruction, and we'll find in Hilsenrath's novel that there are actual examples given which very much support the definitional criteria as laid down in international law. So as I said at the outset, he's really making quite a strong case and prosecuting a case on behalf of the Armenians. Now, I'm sure you could be forgiven for not knowing a great deal about Edgar Hilsenrath. He's not, I would say, a particularly kind of frontline famous German Jewish writer, not in his homeland at least, but as we've heard, he became something of a celebrity in Armenia. I'm going to take a few moments in the next part of my talk just to give you a brief sketch of some of the key stations in his life and in his literary career, to the extent that they are relevant for the discussion later on. So if we can just move on. Here we have a map of the Armenian Genocide. you'll see here, we were talking about this just as we were getting ready for the talk earlier. These are the borders of present-day Armenia and the dispute with Nagorno-Karabakh. This is the neighboring territory. The grey round here are the historic Armenian borders, essentially what is today's Eastern Anatolia in Turkey. And the particular representation, the size of the circles there, relate to the number of murders, deaths, forced marches, etc., and express the relative concentration of them. We've heard the figures. It's estimated something like 1.5 million people lost their lives in all sorts of terrible ways. And one particular feature were concentration camps that were established with forced marches into the deserts of Syria. Of course, all of this was Ottoman territory at the time. So Hilsenrath, how does a young man, as he was when he first began his researches into the Armenian genocide in Germany, come to develop this particular interest? So very briefly, as I always say, by way of introducing you to him, he's born 1926 in Leipzig and lives after that in Halle. His mother is from the Romanian territories of the former Habsburg Empire, the so-called Bukovina, German-speaking. He spends his summer holidays, here he is, with the extended family in a town called Seret. And from August 1938, he lives there with his family. They essentially flee Germany. By 1938, of course, the National Socialist persecution of the Jews has already started to take shape. He flees there to spend time with his grandparents, whilst his father emigrates to France with a view to the family actually being reunited, which was, however, to take many years before that could actually occur. This photograph here is him in Seret with a Zionist youth group. And there's lots of autobiographical writings that describe his time there very much as an idyllic childhood and early adolescence. Of course, this all came to a very abrupt end. 22nd of June 1941, the National Socialists, the German armies invade the Soviet Union. And within 3 days of that invasion, Hilsenrath and his family are rounded up and transported via very circuitous and long routes from Seret, which is roughly around here, Chernovitsi, as it to use its name today, to what is known as Transnistria. This is an area between two rivers, the Dniester River and the Bug River. Here we've got Odessa, and here would be the Crimea. And he was transported to the ghetto, a notorious ghetto of Mogilev-Podolsk. And he spent best part of 3 years there. This photograph here on the right shows the Jewish families having to make what was actually a very dangerous trip over the Dniester River by barge. This photograph here is a school where they sought refuge and somehow managed to survive as a family. There's estimated 50,000 people who were incarcerated in the ghetto, of whom only 10,000 were able to survive. And we'll see that that had some implications for Hilsenrath, both at a personal level and also at a literary, artistic level. Moving then on, in order to avoid being enlisted by the Red Army, he lies about his age. The Russians liberate the ghetto at the end of March 1944. And through kind of quite adventurous routes, he manages to get himself to Palestine. He spends time there working on a number of kibbutz in Tel Aviv, in Haifa, amongst others, doing really menial jobs. He's a gardener, he washes plates in a restaurant, he's a stretcher bearer in a hospital, etc., etc. And he's basically waiting to get papers so that he can travel to France, and that takes a couple of years before he's able to do that. The one picture that you've got there is him with his friends on the beach in Tel Aviv. So there's trips to France. There's he's reunited with his family. Here they are. It's his brother Manfred, who later becomes a very respected academic in the United States, and the mother and father, and himself here on the left. This is quite a traumatic time for him. He starts to work through the experiences that he'd had in the ghetto at the same time as trying to write about them. He falls into deep depressions, and amongst other things, he subjects himself to or arranges to have electroshock therapy by way of treating the depression. And he puts on record in some of his autobiographical essays that this has a great deal to do with classic survivor guilt of a young man of his age and his experiences. And then just very briefly, and finally, he emigrates out to New York, becomes an American citizen. He lives something of a kind of hand-to-mouth existence, again, working in cafes, waiting on tables, and writing, feverishly writing by night, with very, very little success. And it is an enormous struggle, as I've said already, for him to find expression for some of his experiences. Finally, in 1975, I beg your pardon, he re-emigrates, you might say, to Berlin, the kind of capital of the literary scene, and it's in Berlin where he starts to get recognition for his work. I'm just very briefly going to give a brief overview of his broader work before we turn to his preoccupation with Armenia. So here we have essentially his major works. Nacht was published in 1964. This was the book that he started to write just after the war, 20 years in the making. And it recounts his own horrors of trying to survive in the ghetto. He wrote about the most difficult conditions that he experienced. And it really is a harsh and uncompromising portrayal of life in the ghetto. And it was quite controversial for offering, shall we say, a less than edifying portrait of the people who were living there. And the focus that he has is on the victims as opposed to on the perpetrators. He comes to international fame with this book, The Nazi and the Barber. The first two were published in the States in English before being translated into German. The Nazi and the Barber, the German title is Der Nazi und der Friseur. This gained him international fame. It's a grotesque story about an SS member who pretends to be Jewish after the war in order to escape prosecution. It sold millions. It was published by Doubleday in New York, and that got him contracts in Germany, where it also became quite a scandalous success, we might say. The Story of the Last Thought is 1988. He regards it as his best book. He referred to it as his most poetic book. And as I will go on to show, it was really the culmination of a lifelong study and preoccupation with Armenia, with its history, and in particular that of the genocide. So just before I move on, this book here from 1992, Yossel Wasserman's Return. This describes life really as he experienced it in the 1930s in the Bukovina, in the Romanian former Habsburg Empire, amongst the Jewish community there. And Berlin Endstation is probably his last big novel. I'll refer to that in a second. So the preoccupation with Armenia. We have got documents, and I should say some of the things I'll be showing you are taken from his literary archive, which is kept in the Academy of Arts in Berlin. I was allowed access to it and spent several weeks going through his literary papers. And there I found his first literary attempt to deal with the genocide, which was titled Armenia, My Love, written in English. It's a 20-page document, and it takes the form of a screen treatment. The idea at the time would appear to have been to make a film. But there are other works of his, later works, I beg your pardon, sorry, go back to this, where he actually references the genocide. So the book, The Adventures of Reuben Jablonski, which was published in 2002, I think. In this book, he describes how he made the journey overland to Palestine on the so-called Baghdad Railway, and he refers, as he's with his girlfriend and they're passing the territories, they can look over to Anatolia as they pass on the train at that stage on their journey. And in this, he actually refers to the events in Armenia of 1915, and I quote, as the first state prosecuted genocide of the 20th century. Explicitly in those terms. He then goes on to document some of the major crimes, and he also records some of those numbers that we've heard relating to the number of people who died. And of his various books, many of which have got an autobiographical aspect to them, Reuben Jablonski is probably the one that is closest to Hilsenrath himself. There's lots in the book that really encourages that view. And what it does document, I guess, is that as he's passing in 1944, 1945, end of 1944, that he's already very much aware of what had happened in 1915. In this book here, Berlin Endstation, his last major novel, that is autobiographical, tells about his time in Berlin, and also tells us quite a lot about the writing of the fairy story, the story of the last thought. So a very early preoccupation, a lifelong preoccupation. I think I should add that it wasn't just with Armenia. Some of the papers in his literary archive point to studies and interest in the fate of African Americans in the United States, where there's a real strong sense of how race can lead to persecution, to murder, to death. As we've heard already, very conveniently, he's not the first German writer to write about the Armenian genocide, and we might just reflect on why that is the case in a few moments' time. Franz Werfel, who wrote this major book about historical events from 1915, when Armenians from Eastern Anatolia were driven, expelled, to be rescued eventually by French naval ships. This was an event which, as David said at the time, together with other things that were happening in Armenia, that garnered huge international attention. I did a search of the archive of the New York Times, and there are literally dozens of articles documenting what happened in Armenia for an international public as they were happening. Winston Churchill at the time referred to the Armenian genocide as, and I quote, an administrative Holocaust. The British government published one of its so-called blue books, a blue book which documented the crimes in great detail. And of course, this is the First World War. Ottoman Empire is allied with Germany. Germany and Austria are, of course, enemies of Britain and subsequently the United States. But it was all there. It was very, very clearly documented, and there was a lot of public outrage. Some of the documents we heard of Morgenthau, Henry Morgenthau, the German ambassador to Turkey. He writes a memoir which is very, very vivid and very graphic and very detailed about the crimes. German travelers, German religious people documented these, and there was one particular figure, a man called Armin Wegener, who was a photographer, whose photos of the horrendous acts were very well publicized in the 1920s. He ends up being murdered by the Nazis. So it is very much known and recognized at the time, but realpolitik very quickly gave way to, well, I suppose, led to an eventual turning of the back, turning of a blind eye, and by the time Armenian Republic is set up in 1922, you've got kind of wholesale indifference. So moving then on to the story of the last thought then. Hilsenrath wanted to take a broader view of the genocide than, say, somebody like Werfel had done. Werfel focuses very much on an internationally, at the time, notorious event. He takes a much bigger historic sweep than others who have approached it. And he sets out very much for it to be an historical novel, and at the same time, a fairy tale. It's referred to as ein Märchen, yeah? So a fairy tale, but the subtitle is a historical novel from the Caucasus. And these two genres, a historical novel and a fairy tale, you might think could be seen to be at odds with one another. But as I'll show, I think they serve the author very well indeed. So let me tell you a little bit about this particular work. It's got it's a great big tome, something like 600 pages or so in the edition that I have on the shelves behind me. It's got a geometric structure divided into 3 books of similar length, in rising equal multiples of 6 chapters. There's a 20-page prologue and a 2-page epilogue, which are set in the historical present and really set the work that we read, as it were. These are bookends in a broader context. At the back, there's a glossary that explains the very extensive use of Armenian and Turkish vocabulary in the book. And as I said, most of the novel's essential elements are already prefigured in its title and its subtitle, The Fairy Story and the Historical Novel. So let me give you a brief outline of the book, and I will have to be brief. The novel's self-consciously fictional status is established already in the very beginning. We're told that the story we're about to hear is the last thought, the dying thought of a man called Tovma Katassian. He's Armenian, he's 73 years old. At the time of the novel's writing, or publication, he is as old as the genocide. He is one of only 2 members of his family to have survived it. The novel bears many of the hallmarks of a classical Oriental fairy tale. It unfolds as dialogues in the protagonist's head with an imagined storyteller, or meda, to use the term. And this meda is like a figure from 1001 Nights. He's kind of like a genie figure who's imbued with magical powers. He's that magical helper, that stock character in fairy tales, who is able to help Tovma, the 73-year-old Tovma, embark on a quest for knowledge and truth. He wants to find out the truth of the genocide. He wants to find out what happened to his family. And we take a kind of a magic carpet ride through time and space. We eavesdrop on conversations of historical personages, of the three pashas, the three key figures within the Turkish government, for example. And constantly there's a leitmotif of once upon a time. He uses the Turkish phrase for this that comes out all the time. And the text conveys to us very clearly that the stories we're about to hear of the peasant Cartassian family in the remote mountainous heartlands of Eastern Anatolia are entirely imaginary. Yeah, it's a fiction. What we have is a kind of composite of Armenian experience over several generations, a document of persecution, and, as I said at the very outset, a retrieval and exploration of vanished customs, practices, and folk culture. The storyteller signals this explicitly through the text, no more so in the story of Tovma's miraculous birth. But we tell this may or may not have happened. Maybe it's a fiction, maybe it's imagined. Tovma, like his creator, has undertaken all manner of research and now requires an act of storytelling in order to make his people's history and to locate his family's place in it. He seeks to bear witness, but also be an eyewitness to the destruction in the face of modern Turkey's actions to keep what is referred to in the prologue, the Armenian file containing the truth of the genocide secret. In the prologue, there's an imaginary conversation between Tovma and a Turkish official at the United Nations in New York. He seeks not to punish or demand retribution so much, rather to insist on the monetary potential, on the warning potential of the Armenian genocide in order to avoid similar atrocities in future. And to this end, he chronicles some of the horrendous acts and their systematic coordination from the epicenter of the Turkish government throughout the novel. But he does more than that. He actually, unlike Therefore, he takes a much, much longer view. He actually goes right back and recounts tales of the persecution of the Armenians through the centuries. And in particular, at the end of the 19th century, the so-called Hamidian massacres, when 300,000 Armenians were slaughtered. And then in the early 1900s, other events, including a massacre of 200,000 Armenians. So it is this much broader perspective. He basically would argue that the Armenian genocide isn't just 1915 or to 1920, 2022. It goes right back at least 50 to 100 years and quite possibly longer. What he contends in 1915 is what historians several years after he was writing this novel, several decades after he was writing this novel, refer to as a cumulative radicalization of criminal acts against the Armenians, as Ottoman Turkey was facing renewed pressures during the First World War. So the novel has a very clear didactic purpose. Yeah, it's a family story, it's a fiction, but the reader is shown that the genocide did take place and that in every respect it meets the UN's legal definition of the term. So that's essentially as it were, the historical case that is made. If I can just move on now to my next slide. Which seems to have conveniently frozen. There we go. Apologies for that. So in making the historical case, I'd like to emphasize that in many ways he was ahead of the historiographical game in the 1980s. There's evidence in the novel that is based on historical researches that was actually only to get the attention it deserved from historians sometime later. And this perhaps has to do with the fact that he draws on German language resources. So here we have, this is just the Hilsenrath archive. There are folders and folders of his historical research. And in particular, he draws on Foreign Office documents like these here that were only released in the mid-80s from the Austrian state archives. Of course, the Habsburg Empire is allied with Germany and therefore with the Ottoman Empire. He also looks at Turkish resources as were kind of translated into German. Here we have a cable, an encrypted cable from the Minister of the Interior, Talat Pasha, which is actually giving the order for the systematic murder of the Armenians. And in terms of genocide definition, or the UN definition of genocide, that kind of clear plan, the systematic order that is given, which is sometimes in subsequent genocides, as we know, is difficult to find that particular evidence and is used sometimes by the perpetrating nation to say, well, you know, there was nothing systematic about this. The conventional Turkish view of what happened to the Armenians was, well, we had this community, sympathies with our Russian aggressors, and these kind of things happen. We had to resettle people, and it wasn't systematic, and people died, and it's regrettable, but we really bear no great deal of responsibility for it. A slight digression here. This is just to remind us of the Ottoman, Turkey and German alliance. So here we have a picture of the Kaiser, Wilhelm II, who's meeting Enver Pasha on this particular battle cruiser that is named, which was a gift to the Turkish state. And this is in October 1917, when there was a kind of a treaty renewal. Germany had big plans with its ally to build a direct rail connection to Syria and Iraq to have access to the oil fields there, the so-called Berlin-Baghdad Railway. And you remember that it's the very same railway that Hilsenrath traveled to Palestine on. Interestingly, because of this involvement during the First World War, which Hilsenrath really did very closely research, there was a great deal of continuity, sometimes in personnel, between the German Imperial Army and those who would later to serve in the German army under Hitler. Just a few examples to give this, and as I say, Hilsenrath was well aware of this. So one figure, Konstantin von Neurath, who was the foreign minister in Germany from 1932 to 1938, later the so-called Reichsprotektor in Bohemia and Moravia during the criminal regime of Reinhard Heydrich. He was a diplomat in the German embassy in Constantinople at the time. Hitler's first chief of staff, a man by the name of Max Erwin von Scheubner-Richter, died at his side during the beer hall putsch of 1923. And the actual kind of close affinity between the National Socialists and members of the Turkish regime during the First World War has been very, very clearly researched. There is a book which refers to, it's called Justifying Genocide, and it's about Germany and the Armenians from Bismarck to Hitler, which came out just a few years ago. You'll be aware of this. This is Hitler's statement attributed to Hitler on the very close to the invasion of Poland. It's a statement he made, who after all speaks today of the annihilation of the Armenians. He made the statement to embolden his commanders to basically commit the most horrendous crimes and not fear impunity, because the awareness of the Armenian genocide by 1939 had actually lessened very, very significantly. And I think when you consider some of those longer standing German-Ottoman links, on the one hand, you consider some of the continuities in personnel between the two regimes, that sheds a slightly, I think, more nuanced light on that particular notorious statement. Okay, I'm going to come to the latter part of my talk now. So I've said quite a bit about the historical aspects of the novel, that Hilsenrath wanted to break the Turkish silence surrounding the carnage visited on the Armenians, but he also wanted to commemorate their culture. A culture that was, as we heard earlier, was simultaneously destroyed. And he's using the term culture in a very broad sense. The British cultural historian Raymond Williams defined culture as a whole way of life. And in the bulk of the novel, we actually get some wonderful depictions of everyday rural life in a prototypical Armenian village, which goes by the name of Yerisu. This occurs in book 2 of the novel. It is the novel's longest part. And the work I've done in the Hilsenrath archives in Berlin actually revealed that he undertook massive research over very, very many years into all sorts of Armenian practices, names, proverbs, rituals, customs, superstition, courtship and religious practices, geography, general history. There's an entire folder devoted to Armenian food and cuisine. And as you'd expect, given the form of the novel, there is copious material that he worked his way through on the Armenian store of fairy tales. And he did say that it was on discovering this store of Armenian fairy tales that emboldened him really to choose this particular form of depicting the historical events. The fidelity to detail is absolutely remarkable. You've got all sorts of details of the broader historical events, but I think it's much more significant that Hilsenrath uses it to actually document folklore, legends, etc., agricultural accoutrements, all those things that I've mentioned. But he does it in a way that's interesting, that he also highlights some of the similarities in these customs and cuisine, etc., between Armenians and between Turks. And he's suggesting that some of the barriers and the prejudices that are erected between peoples, I wouldn't say are artificial, but they are constructed ones, because there are many things which unite the two communities in terms of their broader customs and practices. And there's all sorts of examples of that. So a novel which, to cite the title that I've referred to and the subtitle, a novel that is both a fairy tale and a historical novel, might, as I said, appear to be something of a paradox. But it works, I think, on two levels. First, Hilsenrath manages to convey the acts of the perpetrators and the magnitude of the suffering in a way that blends meticulously researched history with fantasy, with imagination. This actually, I think, opens up a new way of engaging with the material. It's a way that encourages empathy, and it's a way that can make an invented story of this kind of prototypical Cartesian family appear almost more truthful, or be more truthful, than the Turkish historical record of denial. And in choosing this form, he also largely avoids the brutal realism. The brutal realism, it has to be said, of some of his other novels that dealt with the Holocaust. And he avoids some of the ethical dilemmas and questions which the fictional representation of atrocity can generate. And here is a quote from the novel. There's lots of kind of dialogic insertions from the narrator who's commenting on the way he's telling the story and on the action. And here he's making the claim that there is a truth to fiction. The tales that he tells are not fairy tales, they're true stories. The word in the German is Geschichten. So Geschichte is a story and history. The reality presented in literary form might be different from the actual reality, but that reality can often appear unreal to us, and it's a way of capturing it. And the next quote is in similar vein. So Tovma, the main character, asks the fairy story, who the fairy teller, the Meda, the storyteller, at one point, why do you keep telling me lies? Because there's loads of stuff that's invented. I want to tell the truth. There's this quest for truth all the way through. So, but I tell you lies because I'm a fairy storyteller. What do you expect? Yeah, I'm a narrator. I'm an inventor of stories. But all I'm doing is narrating the truth in a different way. And he also comments on them much later. Sometimes there's no other choice than to seek the final truth in the imagination. So I think I'll draw things to a close. I would just like to make a few concluding remarks. What we have with this particular work, this particular preoccupation by a Holocaust survivor with a genocide that predates the Holocaust, you might say we've got a post-Holocaust depiction of a pre-Holocaust genocide. I think it's still very relevant to the present day. We heard from David at the beginning, you know, the fear of persecution, of murder, of attacks, of violence doesn't recede. It's there. If we look around the world today, if we look at what's been happening in Myanmar with the Yazidi community, etc., that genocide is all around us. And I noticed today, apparently today is World Earth Day, and there was a declaration released by 23 very prominent scholars of the Holocaust in Germany, which were pointing up the risks there are, the dangers and the interconnections between the climate crisis and all the challenges and problems that it throws up, and genocide, arguing that the one can actually heighten the risk of the other. So I hope you found that interesting. As I say, it's a book that was written sometimes decades before historical studies were able to point up the same detail. And I think it's a book, because it's a fiction, because it's literature, can speak to all sorts of people in different communities, in different societies around the world, and at the same time inform them. And I'm going to finish just with a quote as we're having this discussion in South Africa. It's from some time ago now, first published in 1999 from Desmond Tutu. And I guess in many ways it's stating what Tali was saying at the very beginning. why there are compelling reasons why we should learn about the Holocaust and the genocides committed against other people. And he argues later on, if the world had been conscious of the genocide which was committed by the Ottoman Turks against the Armenians, the first genocide of the 20th century, then perhaps humanity might have been more alert to the warning signs that were being given before Hitler's madness was unleashed on an unbelieving world. And I think that's probably the sentiment that will resonate with most of us. So thank you very much for your attention. That was a little bit rushed at times. As I say, it's this massive novel, but I hope it's left you, whetted your appetite or your interest in Edgar Hilsenrath a little bit. Thanks very much indeed. I'm happy to have any questions or answer any queries, and possibly we can get a discussion going. I mean, I think one thing that I would say is interesting, where you get parallels and comparisons drawn between criminal acts perpetrated at different times in different places, where there are some commonalities, but of course, some very significant differences. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. Professor Finlay, would you mind stop sharing your screen so that we can
Sure.
see you and everyone else? Thank you. That was incredible. That was very eye-opening, and thank you for taking us through that journey and the detail and telling us about the life of Edgar and how he grew up and what inspired him. There are a few questions that I will pose to you. And my first question actually is in line with Mira's question. It's about the use of fiction versus nonfiction when it comes to historical events. Is the reception of a genocide story or of a history better when it is fictionalized through a novel form? Or so what's the reception like versus when it is nonfiction? And in fact, Mira asks a similar question. So I'll just ask our two questions together. She says, can the speaker speak more about the use of the imaginative to be able to best express the truth of the horror in genocide? The same kind of exploration has been seen in Holocaust literature, often with controversy. What is the value of these explorations?
Mm-hmm.
Can you, or maybe I'll ask you another one.
No.
I think, yeah. Can you just address, that's a very important question, because there is often controversy when you fictionalize historical events.
Yes, well, indeed. I mean, thank you for the question. That's a very interesting question, and you're absolutely right. I mean, for a long period of time after 1945, it was contended, for example, that literary depictions of the Holocaust were not to be encouraged or tolerated. That only memoirs and real accounts could give something that was accurate and real, and that in trying to represent in a fictional form, it risks trivializing, it risks sentimentalizing, and in extremis, it was actually offensive to the memory of the people, of the victims, and to the people who might have survived. And there's a really substantial research literature looking into this. The question that it raises, I think, is how do we portray the unspeakable? How do we speak about the unspeakable? Do we surrender before the challenge of that, or do we struggle and strive to find adequate literary forms to express what various things that have happened, for example, during the Armenian Genocide, and horrific acts? I mean, they are absolutely horrific. As is the case, you can read accounts of 1915 and compare them with 1992 in Rwanda. You can compare them with, all these crimes against humanity that continue to occur. For somebody like Hilsenrath, he writes the bulk of his novels are actually about the Holocaust. And he seeks to find, it's this constant struggle for an adequate representation. So the first book that I talked about, Night, is brutally realist. Yeah, it's unflinching in the detail that it shows, and it was hugely controversial as a consequence of that, and was condemned in some quarters when it was published in Germany. It was essentially kind of, I wouldn't say censored, but it received one damning critique and was then politely withdrawn from circulation. Not perhaps for reasons you might be thinking, but because of its depiction of the terrible lives and moral dilemmas that victims faced in the struggle for survival. He then writes a book, The Nazi and the Barber, Der Nazi und der Friseur, which was controversial because he indulges in grotesqueries, in humor. There's a whole vein of scholarship and attention being given to so-called, any attempt to have a humorous literary depiction. And I think with this particular book, what we have is something that is on the one hand historically extremely accurate. Yeah. So the accusation of trivializing or of missing detail, I don't think can be leveled, and yet it doesn't dwell overly on descriptions of violence. There are some, yeah, but it eschews these for in favor of being an act of commemoration as well. So I think I'm probably not answering the question particularly well, but it's ultimately, do you think that there is anything that is off limits for literary representation? Yeah, and those views have been held and are still held. Personally, I think the answer to that is a challenge on the aesthetic form, on the literary form that a writer chooses to find expression. And I guess I'm picking up on the final point in the question. A novel like this can tell me as much about the Armenian Genocide as I've got shelves full of histories. There are details in there that are also in the novel, but it actually engages me in a different way. And I think ultimately what it does is provide empathy on the one hand, but the way Hilsenrath goes about it is not idealized. We don't get an idealized depiction of the victims, or kind of a kitsch sentimental depiction. There are various techniques that are used there that distance us in a critical way from some of the depiction of the victim. So yeah, my short answer would be it's always a challenge to artists to depict the darkest sides of humanity, whatever the context and whatever the age, and whether it's in music or whether it's in visual art or whether it's in literature.
So when the story of The Last Thoughts was first published, what was the reception? How was it received?
Okay, that's really interesting, because it was published in Germany in 1988 at a time when a fierce intellectual debate was being waged, which went by the name of the historians' dispute. Okay, and the reception context is fascinating. So essentially, in the 1980s, there was a kind of a revisionist trend in German historiography that started to draw comparisons between the Holocaust and between other acts of totalitarian regimes, notably of the Soviet Union. And what you had, on the two kind of camps, it was a very divisive issue. You had, and I'm putting these in crude terms, an essentially more right-wing revisionist group of historians in opposition to, or being opposed by, I should say, liberal historians who were basically saying you can't draw these comparisons. It's a false comparison because what you're doing is equating. Yeah, you're making an equation. You're saying X is the same as Y. Yeah. Now, into this comes Hilsenrath's book, and because of some of the parallels that I just pointed to, but they're very, very strong in them all between National Socialism and acts against the Jews, and Ottoman Turkey's acts against the Armenians, it was misunderstood as being somehow a justification for drawing these very crude comparisons. And that led to it being controversial for that particular reason. But the interesting thing, the more nuanced approaches, is that yes, there are you can draw comparisons, yeah, but a comparison is not the same as an equation. And in fact, in making a comparison, you can actually better understand the phenomenon of the two things that you are comparing. So relating this to Armenia, we know that Raphael Lemkin made very, very close studies of the Armenian Genocide. He was a young man in Germany, and in the early 20s, as I said, there was a very strong awareness of Armenia and what had happened in the First World War. One of the so-called pashas, one of the politicians, was assassinated publicly in Berlin. Yeah, so he made major studies. He's also the first person to talk about the Armenian genocide in those terms in an interview with CBS television in 1950. I think. So some of the definitions that you find that work his way into, you know, the idea of a racial group, some of the examples of the acts actually are influenced by his reading of the Armenian genocide. But of course, when you read Hilsenrath, you see some of the significant differences as well. And for me, you know, and this is, as I say, when one has these debates with colleagues and the like, what emerges as a fundamental difference between the Holocaust and the Armenian Genocide is that the National Socialists had an intention to eliminate Jewish citizens, Jewish people, wherever they were in the world. Yeah. Some of the, you know, when you get into these people get into discussions around killing methods and all the rest of it, but that is one of the fundamental differences that can emerge from that particular type of comparison. And those comparisons are still going on. Notice there's a question about colonialism that's coming up. But the idea, there's a great scholar called Michael Rothberg who wrote a book called Multidirectional Memory, that understanding of one act of genocide can actually influence and help understand others, which is essentially, I guess, you know, when Talia and I were out in Rwanda with the Changemakers program, we were drawing to a degree some comparisons because they can be enlightening and helpful, but have to be done carefully and in full knowledge of the facts. Otherwise, you get something which is a crude reduction.
So in fact, on that note, Tali is asking, can you speak about German links between the Herero and Nama genocide in addition to Armenia and the Holocaust?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So you remember in the quote by Desmond Tutu, he refers to Armenia as the first genocide of the 20th century. And that was a view that once there was more general recognition of the Armenian genocide that has held sway, but more recent work would point to the genocide of the Herero and Nama people in German Southwest Africa, where Germany was a colonial power. So essentially, unlike Great Britain and France and Belgium, Germany was very late to the colonizing table and had African territories. And what you had essentially was the German Imperial Army massacring these two tribes people from the Nama and the Herero. They set up concentration camps in the desert and the like. And by now, I think there's a general scholarly agreement that this is the first genocide, that it predates Armenia. The links, rather like 10, 15 years later to National Socialism, are very much within personnel, military personnel and figures who were part of that particular army, who then resurface as allies of the Ottoman Turks, and who later are members of the German army under National Socialism. So there's a strong connection between it, and I think that's something which is only more recently, starting to get attention. If I could just go back to the previous question and make a point, my own knowledge of the Herero and Nama massacres actually came initially from a literary work. Okay, so this goes back to probably goes back 30 years. The book was written in 1977, called Merengue by a German writer called Uwe Timm. It's a documentary novel. And this was a time when there was absolutely no awareness or recognition or debate in Germany about its colonial past. And yet Uwe Timm wrote a book which brought a whole generation's attention to it. I think it's also worth mentioning that colonial past currently is the object of in Germany, object of very significant debate, probably openly and to an extended degree for the first time proper. The whole, there's this kind of interesting interpretations that actually point up the links between colonialism of the kind that Hannah Arendt, for example, would point up in her book on the origins of totalitarianism, and between interwar fascism. So, Tali, does that help out? Does that answer your question?
Absolutely, and we're hoping Uwe Timm he was planning to come last year,
okay.
And we're hoping in 2022 that he will.
Okay, oh, brilliant!
Over 80,
yeah.
But
We had him in Leeds. I think he was probably 65 at the time. I think we did a conference for him, and and he read from Merengue actually, and at the conference. So there's a conference in 2004 in Leeds, and there'd just been the first statement by a German official that used the term genocide. And it was the very day that he read from Merengue, although that statement was very quickly retracted, and the official concerned got into hot water about that. But of course, the whole thing around recognition is that with recognition comes the right under international law for restitution, and that's one of the reasons why Turkey to this day refuses to recognize the Armenian genocide. And puts pressure on all its allies and the like to do the same. Sorry.
So in terms of recognition, does it help if other nations recognize the Armenian genocide as a genocide, even if Turkey doesn't recognize it, but if the United States recognizes it, if other nations recognize it as a genocide, is that helpful?
I think the short answer to that is undeniably yes. You can Google maps of the world that show you which territories recognize the Armenian genocide, and it's depressing. I wouldn't say small, but there could be many more significant countries coming forward. So Britain, for example, has vacillated on this for quite a long time. Obama in 2008, Senator Obama, before he was president, said he would recognize, that the US would recognize the Armenian genocide, and then there were votes in the Senate against it. But yes, if you've got major countries coming out recognizing, then others will feel emboldened to do the same. But of course, the position, the geopolitical position of Turkey, if you think of where it is, it's always been kind of that access to strategically important oil supplies, but also as a place for military bases and the like. that successive governments have bowed to real political pressure not to recognise, yeah, in order to keep Turkey within a particular line. You know, if you think of all the wars that have been since, I guess, 1990, you know, the various wars in Iraq and the like, where Turkey has held this very important position. Of course, Turkey, you know, is in the last 10 under Erdogan has become increasingly nativist and nationalist and authoritarian. David mentioned, you know, if you're a writer or intellectual who uses the term Armenian genocide, you risk incarceration. A Nobel Prize winning author faced that. Hilsenrath's publisher was put in prison for 6 months when his book was published in Turkish translation. So there's a lot of coercion that goes on to prevent the official recognition.
Okay, we are running out of time, so I just have maybe one last question, really. Maybe it's more of a comment from Scott, and he says, "So fascinating. Thank you, Frank. So many indigenous and colonized people do not have the same kind of historical archive to lean back on, and have been passing down stories of massacres and land theft from generation to generation without always having the truth power regimes of administrative documents and official histories to back them up. So their stories are now true, in inverted commas, in a way that struggles to be recognized as truth." And that is a struggle that I think many post-colonial nations to this day, particularly in Africa, struggle with. That if you don't have these documents of what happened to your people during colonialism, it sounds like a fable. It sounds like stories that cannot be backed up because there's no documentation.
Yeah. I mean, I think that this is where, you know, for all the great leap forward that was made in international law with the Genocide Convention, that some of the actual legal definitions can be a barrier to precisely those indigenous peoples who lack a written historical record. Just very briefly, I'm aware we're running out of time, but if you have to prove that there was a deliberate order, you know, an order was given to commit acts of genocide, and there isn't a historical record of that, then that is used by the perpetrators to undermine a case that is being made. So you might remember one of the slides I showed of the diplomatic telegram. That is the smoking gun that was found. Personally, I've been very interested in kind of legal definitions of crimes against humanity versus genocide. Yeah, and I think that the legal notion of crime against humanity is more permissive, as it were, and is probably more helpful precisely to those types of community because there isn't that fixation on the order. You know, we've Holocaust deniers refer to the fact that there is no so-called Führerbefehl. There's no written document of the single order. Yeah. That Hitler gave, and that is used as a way of denying genocide. Turkey does the same, and I guess, Scott, I mean, it's a great question actually, that it perhaps illustrates, and maybe coming full circle in this Q&A, the validity of fiction. Yeah, so we know that history is the written record, isn't it? Literally, yeah. But of course, so what is written actually gets into the history books. But it's the capacity to find a way of telling a story, you know, that preserves the memory or the record of what has happened. I suppose we're talking about oral tradition, and this would be the case of, you know, in Australia with the indigenous populations there, etc., etc. So perhaps it's really just a reminder of the power of the imagination and of storytelling as being truth-telling. So story as truth, and that we shouldn't ever shy away from telling stories, even about the most horrific things. But getting the legal, you know, I do think the law needs to move on, actually, from its fixation on historical proof. But of course, lawyers would say, well, you know, that would be anarchy and the like. But for Armenia, you know, the fixation, and possibly even for the Herero Nama, is to prove it's a genocide under the strict terms of the law is actually sometimes, for practical purposes, very difficult. And that actually enables the perpetrators in failing to accept the responsibility for crimes that they perpetrated in the past.
Wow. Professor Frank Finlay, thank you. Thank you for your presentation. Thank you for widening and deepening our knowledge about this history, and for introducing a lot of people to this book, The Story of the Last Thought. Some people have not read this book, and I think maybe after this has inspired some people to try and get a copy of that book, and it's absolutely fascinating. So thank you very much, Professor Finlay. And also thank you to Director Tali Nates, the founder of the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center. Thank you very much. And also thank you to David Abrahamian, the founder and representative of the youth, the Armenian youth of South Africa. And thank you very much to everyone for joining us. I know that there are a lot of other questions and comments on the chat. We will save the chat. And also this is recorded, this session was recorded, so you will get to view it on our YouTube page. Thank you very much. And please join us again for our next webinar next week on the 27th of April, which will be a continuation of our collaboration with the Silt Foundation. And we'll be presenting another incredible writer from that collaboration and series. Keep well and safe. And I hope that next year, when we meet again to commemorate the Armenian Genocide, we can meet in person. So hopefully happy days will return. So be strong. Thank you very much.